Hello. Thanks to the organizers for organizing this, and it's interesting. At age 37, I still get to write what I was writing about when I was 5, which is airplanes. So, the shape of the world to come: aviation, cartography, and globalism in MoMA's Airways to Peace. On February 23rd, 1942. With the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor still fresh in Americans' minds, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt asked radio listeners to pull out a map of the world. "Look at your map," he implored his audience. "We must understand and face that our job right now is to fight at a distance which extends all the way around the globe," end quote. The world map that Roosevelt was referring to was an insert in the December 1941 issue of the National Geographic magazine. Sent to over 1,165,000 subscribers that month, the National Geographic World Map was one of the most widest circulated and well-known maps of its time. It was, in every sense, a familiar image of the world, two hemispheres drawn on an azimuthal equal area projection. It was an image of the world divided into two hemispheres, a division that roughly approximated the separation of the Second World War into Pacific and European theaters of operation. This map, however, presented an inadequate image of the current conflict. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a place deemed geographically insignificant and very far away in the public's mind, was only the latest moment in a war where aviation began to play an increasing role. From Japanese raids in Manchuria to Singapore, to nationalist and Condor Legion strikes in Spain, and attacks by the Regia Aeronautica in Ethiopia in the late 1930s, to Luftwaffe bombers demolishing targets in Central and Western Europe during the opening moments of the Nazi Blitzkrieg, to the massive air battles during the Battle of Britain, the world's armed forces had a greater than ever capability to carry out devastating air attacks across international borders. The scope of the current war required a new conceptualization of the world as a closed, interconnected, and continuous space. This, however, was not just for the public, but for the military as well. As historian Alan Henriksen would put it in the first significant study of World War II era cartography, quote, "What the far-flung operation of the US forces necessitated was a new global geostrategic image, a revised mental picture of the world and the geographic and strategic interrelationship of its parts," end quote. It was not long before American cultural institutions would become vital players in the creation of this revised mental picture. One of these institutions was the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In 1943, Monroe Wheeler, MoMA's Director of Exhibition and Publications, in consultation with the War Department, the Office of War Information, and the United States Office of Strategic Services, developed a concept for a museum exhibition that would demonstrate, quote, "to the layman, in dramatic and lucid sequence, the basic factors of air-age geography and to inspire that understanding which is essential to winning the war and making an effective peace," end quote. The end result was Airways to Peace, an exhibition of geography for the future that considered the roles that aviation and cartography played in the current war and might play in the post-war air age to come. Though Bauhaus emigre Herbert Bayer created the master designs for Airways to Peace, the exhibition featured the work of other members of the design and scientific communities. I just wanted to point out something in this image right here. The woman that's holding the architectural drawings in the far right is Sally Harkness from TAC, who is an unacknowledged contributor to this exhibit. So, relief maps by Norman Belgettis were displayed along globes and maps designed and chosen by cartographers Irving Fisher, Richard Eads Harrison, and George T. Renner. Former presidential candidate Wendell L. Willkie, fresh from his highly publicized airplane trip around the world, also wrote captions for the exhibit as well as for the catalog. The exhibition lasted from July 1st to October 17th, 1943, and included a subsequent traveling version displayed in different American cities. Herbert Bayer's master designs for Airways to Peace features an aggressive orientation featuring the purely visual qualities in contemporary transit cartography. The exhibition's central object is a giant walk-through globe. There, quote, "the spectator finds the land areas depicted on the inside of the globe, enabling him to observe at a glance how 3/4 of the Earth's land in the northern hemisphere, and the extraordinary proximity around the North Pole of the most powerful and populous nations, within easy flying distance of each other, a fact which is the crux of history today," end quote. Additional globes and relief maps continue to depict a world where aviation rules supreme. A 5-foot layered relief model of Europe designed by Belghetti therefore helped aviators in distinguishing the terrain and anticipating the height of vertical elevations. A glass globe allowed visitors, quote, to sight through a point in the center of the earth to find the antipode, opposite place, of any of the great cities in the world, end quote. The exhibition catalog also features an image of Monroe Wheeler standing by one of Airways to Peace's most highly charged objects, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's personal 50-inch globe. Wilkie touts the globe as being one of the most modern of objects, if only for the fact that it contained over 17,000 place names. More importantly, the globe was mounted so that anyone could rotate it. And I should say that the actual globe was, the stand was designed by Henri Dreyfus too. That's another thing that's not acknowledged in the archives. So, like Bayer's outside-in globe, the 50-inch globe was one of many devices providing visitors with an immersive experience. The idea was, of course, that they could experience firsthand the new cartographic realm that Wheeler and Wilkie envisioned. But if cartography was the main visual referent in Airways to Peace, the exhibition installation designs and catalogs showed the importance of military and civil aviation to this vision of the world. The installation and catalog featured images of military aircraft to illustrate the grand narratives in Airways to Peace. Bayer's exhibition design included one wall with images of Army Air Force operations. The exhibition catalog reproduced some of these photographs, one being an image of a Lockheed C-69, the military variant of the soon-to-be famous Lockheed Constellation, as well as other aircraft. A 90-foot mural opposite the exhibition's entrance site depicts military aviation as a vital stage in America's war effort. The dominant feature is a full-scale painted silhouette of the front view of a consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber. On, behind, and underneath this painting are photographs from the current conflict. One shows a PBY Catalina flying boat on patrol over Alaska. Another shows a small Curtiss P-40 Warhawk on an icy Aleutian strip. Douglas A-20 Havocs fly over a desert landscape in another photograph. Lockheed P-38 Lightnings grace another image. An enlargement showing a payload of bombs falling over Sardinia emphasize that these aircraft are not only waging war, but that they are instruments of victory. These images suggest how aviation comprises the latest stage in the scientific enterprise of war. Yet Bayer's exhibition design allows audiences to participate in this enterprise. One example is a wood ramp arching in front of the mural. Atop this ramp, and only from there, a visitor would enjoy a privileged view to a series of aerial photographs placed on the floor, as well as to Belghetti's relief map of Europe. If the outside globe gives spectators a first taste of an azimuth-oriented polar projection necessary for the air age, the ramp gives the first semblance of the power of the aerial view. Although these aerial views offer very little information, the fabricated experience of being aloft becomes important here. Within the confines of an exhibition space, this vantage point gave audience an idealized sensation of flying and seeing the physical terrain below. Placed within an exhibit that deals ostensibly with geography, this part of the exhibit suggests the idea that but for the ability to break away from the inadequacies of the Mercator projection, such vantage points would be impossible. This emphasis on the inadequacies of previous cartographic representations not only informs the didactic intent underlying Airways to Peace's various installations, but also demonstrates the exhibition planner's emphasis on finding imagery appropriate to this intent. It must be noted that at first, MoMA exhibition number 236 was going to be only about cartography and geography. It was to follow in the footsteps of President Roosevelt's 1942 fireside chats that concerned the geographic scope of the current conflict and that mobilized the public by asking them to look at maps. From 1942 into early 1943, Monroe Wheeler corresponded with Princeton politics professor Harold H. Sprout, who was at the time compelling research for a war atlas with the Office of War Information. Sprout wanted the atlas's maps and corresponding text to be supplemented with pictures, quote, pictures that would help immensely in building up a realistic impression of such items as jungle and desert battlefields, the terrain traversed by the Burma Road, the Russian steppe country, etc., end quote. Working with Richard Eads Harrison, the special advisor to the geographer of the State Department, and the Office of Strategic Services, Wheeler came up with a list of potential titles for the exhibit mirroring the organization of Sprout's atlas. Titles like This World We Fight In, Our Shrinking World, and New World Geography were all aimed to show how geographical problems of war are applicable to the maintenance of a just peace. But by March 1943, Wheeler already began thinking about aviation-related themes for the exhibit. In a letter to Roy Stryker, the press chief for the Office of War Information, Wheeler notes how, quote, "In introducing today's maps, we would show to what extent the airplane is responsible for them. Then the general maps will be broken down into maps devoted to the strategic areas outlined in the civilian's geography that you are preparing. And in relation to these maps of strategic areas, we would show photomurals of photographs which I hope you would be able to select and provide, depicting as dramatically as possible the life of our fighters in each theater of operations," end quote. Although aviation now became a part of the exhibition content, the exhibit was still to be dominated by issues of cartography and geography. It was Herbert Bayer's early involvement with the visual materials that helped steer Wheeler towards the exhibit's final aviation-related theme. As early as January 1943, when Exhibit 236 was still called Global War for Global Peace, Bayer was working on a series of morale-building posters detailing the work of the Civil Aeronautics Authority, or CAA. One of Bayer's posters was supposed to show, quote, means by which the CAA controls the airways, end quote. The airways that Bayer refers to here are the various CAA-mandated federal airways, or highways of the air, a 33,000-mile network of airlanes equipped with radio beams, beacons, emergency landing fields, and other facilities. Bayer intended for his posters to show the current role of America's aviation infrastructures by giving an overall impression of the CAA's activities in relation to the war effort, end quote. The posters, with their depictions of the various airways carving aerial routes across American skies, was a visual method of what exhibition planners would later refer to as implementing the air age, the, quote, most accurate general description that can be given in brief for the role of aviation in exhibit number 236, end quote. This focus on CAA-related infrastructures and airways would eventually appear in the exhibit displays and catalog for Airways to Peace. Monroe Wheeler and Richard Eads Harrison also sought cartographic materials that would make a visual impact, even if this meant sacrificing cartographic accuracy for the sake of making an argument. An example of this is the inclusion in the exhibit of polar projections by Wilhelmo Stefansson, the Canadian explorer and scientist famous for his writings about the Arctic. Stefansson's most popular book, The Adventure of Wrangel Island, contained a highly regarded polar projection of the Northern Hemisphere. The polar projection was also a favorite of Harrison's, as it would show lines of true direction and shortest distance, provided that such lines would be drawn through the center. Wheeler collected a large amount of ad copy and magazine images from diverse sources like Consolidated Vultee Corporation, Douglas Aircraft, as well as Popular Mechanics, that showed the importance of polar regions to a reimagined vision of the world. Some of these images even depict larger-than-life aircraft crossing the North Pole in order to attack Asian targets. Various writers, most notably the air power visionary Alexander Prokofiev de Seversky, also looked to polar projections to demonstrate the strategic importance of Arctic regions, as well as to the global dimensions of the Second World War. In Walt Disney Studios' adaptation of de Seversky's manifesto, Victory Through Air Power, the author uses a world globe to show how an attack from the Arctic would cripple the Japanese Empire. Later, an animated sequence depicts a squadron of American bombers taking off from a forward base in Alaska in order to attack targets in the Japanese mainland. Bayer's outside-in globe also serves to show the value of this reimagining of the world. Upon entering, visitors would certainly look at the oculus at the top of the globe, an aperture corresponding to the location of the North Pole. In the middle of the space, then, visitors would train their eyes to what was essentially a polar projection of their world. These polar projections, however, were more important as images of the global extent of the Second World War. Much of the current war was being fought in equatorial and lower altitudes, areas difficult to depict in a polar projection. Another episode demonstrating how Wheeler and Harrison privileged only certain types of cartographic materials for Airways to Peace is the inclusion of an icosahedral globe in the exhibition's visual displays. The icosahedron, with faces comprised of 20 equilateral triangles, is a geometrical solid that closely approximates the shape of a globe. The most popular version of an icosahedral globe was based on R. Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion Air Ocean map, published in the 1942 issue of Life. It has been suggested that the icosahedral globe featured in Airways to Peace is constructed from one of Fuller's Dymaxion maps. It is, however, a Leica globe projection designed by Yale economist Irving Fisher. In April 1943, J. Parker Van Zandt, director of aviation research at the Brookings Institution, suggested to Wheeler that Fisher's Leica globe projection was superior to Fuller's Dymaxion maps because it allowed for greater graphic manipulation. The uniform size of each of the Leica globe's faces allowed more room for the presentation of visual information. In Airways to Peace, however, Bayer mounted the Leica globe on a display pole that allowed visitors to transform the map into a globe and vice versa. Here, with the raising and the lowering of a lever, visitors could literally and quickly recalibrate their literal and figurative view of the world. Airways to Peace was by no means the first exhibit dedicated to the significance of aviation. The use of images of aircraft and other accoutrements of flight placed Airways to Peace in a lineage of exhibition design that would include, among other things, Le Corbusier's concept for the Bada Pavilion in the 1937 Paris Expo. As in Bayer's design for Airways to Peace, Le Corbusier's proposal included the display of both aircraft and maps. Le Corbusier would continue this trajectory with his Pavillon des Temps Nouveaux for the same expo, which featured a Bloch 174 bomber. The same aircraft would also feature prominent in Robert Delaunay's and Félix Aublay's interior design for the Pavillon de l'Air at the 1937 expo. And only 4 years before the opening of Airways to Peace, William Lescaz's and J. Gordon Carr's aviation building for the 1939 World's Fair in New York also used architecture to convey messages about the future of aviation. This hangar-like building, with its various large aircraft suspended from the ceiling, was supposed to provide audiences with a feeling of flight in space. Though Bayer also sought to create a similar immersive environment with his exhibition designed for Airways to Peace, an important distinction must be made. Here, cartographic space is translated into architectural space. In the main hall of the exhibition, for example, Bayer strung wires from floor to ceiling at intersecting angles. The effect, though disorienting, was evocative. Within the space of Airways to Peace, Bayer renders the very markers of traditional cartographic space, perpendicular lines, wholly useless. A visitor walking through the exhibition would notice the breaking and distorting of orthogonal lines associated with outdated Mercator projections. The fragmentation of architectural space calls attention to the more favorable, orderly surfaces of globes interspersed throughout the exhibition installation, the true cartographies to be experienced. This evocation of cartographic space as devoid of lines of longitude and latitude was one of the distinguishing features of air-age globalism. This resonates with the idea that the space of air-age globalism is a round, continuous sphere, an ocean of air with no separate parts and no land features, save for airports. As an exhibition of geography for the future, the exhibition materials, spaces, and catalog for Airways to Peace foretold the impact of cartography and aviation in the maintenance of a post-war world. This was due in no small part to the exhibit's visual didactics. So much so that by September 1943, Lieutenant Richard Stilwell of the Naval Air Combat Information School wrote to MoMA director Alfred Barr asking to borrow many of the exhibition's visual and cartographic materials to teach map projection to pilots. But more importantly, the exhibit was a cultural response echoing the future promises of an aerial diplomacy. The exhibition planners were always very cognizant of this. A lively public debate regarding the future of aviation, carried out in national newspapers and magazines, influenced the scope and content of Airways to Peace only a couple months before its opening. MoMA's trustees were even afraid that the current exhibit, with its decidedly techno-geographical bent, would lose sight of any potential geopolitical implications. In May 1943, Alfred Barr wrote to Monroe Wheeler, warning him of a potential lost opportunity. Quote, "I realize that you may not want to complicate the show, but it seems to me that it would be to a large extent wasted unless it were pointed out that in a world so radically altered by air communication, we have an overwhelming and inevitable national responsibility for international cooperation. This is a political conclusion, but one to which I think all, or practically all, of our trustees would heartily subscribe, whatever their party affiliation." End quote. The trustees' reference to a national responsibility for international cooperation was inspired by a popular 1942 article by Vice President Henry A. Wallace called New Paths to Freedom. In the article, Wallace envisioned the existence of a joint international highway and airway authority, assuring access to all the nations which are eager to eliminate fear from the world and observe the principles of new democracy in their dealings. End quote. This was an impulse that would continue in the years to come, specifically in the negotiations for the 1944 Chicago Convention of Civil Aviation. The exhibition materials and spaces of Airways to Peace would reflect such views. The most emphatic statement about the exhibit's views on the future appears at the entrance. There, a large wall-sized photographic enlargement depicts an airplane flying through billowing cloud formations. Two lines connect the airplane to a drawing of a falling Icarus superimposed onto the photograph. Above the mural was the show's title, and in extremely large type, but not quite as large as Airways to Peace, was text by Wendell L. Willkie. To the left of the entrance, at eye level, a placard contains the first words of Willkie's introduction, quote, "We have always known two kinds of geography. Nature drew the oceans, continents, mountains, rivers, and plains. Men etched in cities and national boundaries. For our well-being, we have tried to harmonize natural and man-made geography. But the modern airplane creates a new geographical dimension. The world is small and the world is one. The American people must grasp these new realities if they are to play their essential part in winning the war and building a world of peace and freedom." End quote. Here then, in an exhibit in the Midtown Manhattan Museum, visitors would enter a space that depicted the world as one, but that promoted the main aspiration of American air-age globalism, the limitless expansion of America's aviation interests. As a legacy of the interwar period that came to a stunning realization during the Second World War, the logic of total war required the planning and mobilization of the domestic economy, a logic that made no distinction between civilian and military combatants. Yet the term total war had an aerial connotation, one that Italian air power theorist Giulio Douhet outlined in his influential command of the air from 1921. In that book, Douhet observed how, quote, "The prevailing forms of social organization have given war a character of national totality. That is, the entire population and all the resources of a nation are sucked into the maw of war," end quote. Such logic would account for the participation of cultural institutions like MoMA in the war effort. It is in this sense that Airways to Peace reflects a culture of total war. The various architectural, aviation, and cartographic materials for Airways to Peace provide a series of visual tropes necessary for mobilizing the public. Though the space of the exhibit converted cartographical space into architectural space, and though the various aviation and aeronautical related material promoted American technological prowess, the most compelling image in Airways to Peace was the globe. Much more than a geometrical solid, the globe was not only a powerful visual aid that would help the American public reimagine the space of the Second World War, but it was also a powerful image pointing to a promise of a future world. It was, in many ways, to borrow and modify a term from H.G. Wells, the shape of the world to come. The globe was a symbol evoking a future Pax Americana ruled from the air. Within the spaces of MoMA's Airways to Peace, aviation became far more than just a general concern. American aviation was now a global concern. Thanks.